Welcome to the Eric Metaxas Show. It's the show everyone's talking about, but they really should be listening to it. This is the Eric Metaxas Show with your host, Eric Metaxas.
Yes, that's my name. I get to have so much fun, folks. If you listen to my previous conversation with Stephen Meyer, Dr. Stephen Meyer, the scientist, the author of Darwin's Doubt, the author of Signature in the Cell, one of the principal figures in the intelligent design movement, you know that we were just getting started. And I said, we'd like to have you back as soon as possible. What about right now? And he said, okay. And so, Stephen Meyer, here we are. Thank you for being with us. You can say hello.
Oh,
or
hello!
Something. I want people to know that you're really here. You nodded on radio.
This is not helpful.
No, it's so, but it's so great to have the time to actually continue the conversation, because some of these conversations, you suddenly realize, well, we just scratched the surface, and there is so much here. Your first book, Signature in the Cell, we were kind of talking about how for life to just arise from nothing doesn't make sense. And you were saying that there's a code, there seems to be a code, and people are beginning to figure this out. Colleagues who are not Christians, who are not people of faith, you're saying that they themselves are saying it looks a little spooky.
A lot of people are beginning to recognize there are really profound problems, not only with, as we were talking about in the last hour, the theory of chemical evolution, how you get from non-living chemicals to the first living cell, but also now the theory of biological evolution. Darwin's theory, or the modern version of it known as neo-Darwinism, is increasingly being doubted by leading evolutionary biologists, not just scientists generally, but people working in the field know that, in particular, the mechanism that we all learn about, natural selection, acting on random mutations, that mechanism has very limited creative power.
Okay, that is a headline.
It should be a huge headline.
That's a huge stinking headline.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like what you said in our previous hour when you talked about, we've all heard the mythical stuff done in the lab by Miller in the 1950s, and they put electricity in a little, Erlenmeyer flask or whatever it is, and Shazam, they got the amino acid. And then you realize, you know what? That didn't really work. That's not sufficient. But nobody ever said, hey, wait a second. We now have no real explanation. They just kind of went with it as though, well, it's good enough.
The retraction never gets printed in the textbook.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so it's basically becomes a placeholder.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a placeholder for 50-something years. Right. If you said to some kid, in high school, how did life start? Well, there was an experiment in the 50s, but even though that experiment was effectively discredited, I mean, they basically said,
look, it's completely discredited as having any relevance. It was fine chemistry, but it didn't have any relevance to how life got started.
We never got the headline that says, stop the presses, we don't know how life evolved from nothingness. We thought we figured it out. We haven't figured it out. Now you're telling me that the second piece, which is to say, okay, let's assume there's life. Fine. We don't know how it happened, but let's not talk about that. We have life. How did that life evolve into complex creatures, into kitty cats and human beings and elephants and birds? How did that happen? We've always been told random mutations and
natural selection.
Natural selection accounts for it. We've been told it over and over and over. And then we find out now, no, scientists themselves are saying this has too many holes. This doesn't seem to be sufficient. But there have been no headlines saying that the thing that we've swallowed for 100 years isn't cutting it.
Yeah, this is one of the provocative themes I struck in the prologue to Darwin's Doubt. I made the claim, and I actually first made this at a Socrates in the City event that you had me do in Washington with you in 2013 when I was writing the book.
Right.
That as I got into the technical literature in evolutionary biology, I realized there's a huge disparity between the public presentation of the status of modern Darwinian theory on the one hand, and the actual status of the theory when you read the technical scientific articles and books written by the leading people in evolutionary biology.
Now, this is not just true in your field. I've noticed this, that the pop culture lags dramatically behind the cutting edge reality. I mean, we can talk about Alfred Kinsey. All of that stuff has been discredited, dramatically discredited. He was abusing little children to get his quote-unquote facts, and on and on and on. But he becomes a hero, and then the bad information leaks out 30, 40, 50 years later, and nobody ever goes back and says he's been debunked. Kinsey's
and it's taught as consensus science.
It's taught as consensus, but the same thing with Freudianism. I mean, can you imagine for decades people are talking Freud. Now nobody, is talking about the id. It's just one of those things that's become part of the pop culture, but the science, the academic level has moved way past it. But there's that disconnect. And so you're telling me that disconnect exists in science with regard to evolution, that the top people are saying what we've been teaching for 50 years, for 100 years, it's insufficient.
They're saying we need a new theory.
That's big stuff. That's a headline.
Major book, 2003, MIT Press, on the origin of organismal form, written by two leading evolutionary biologists, Gerd Muller and Stuart Newman. In the opening chapter of this book, they explain that neo-Darwinism is still the accepted textbook theory of evolution, but they go on to say that the theory has that this idea has no theory of the generative, how you generate fundamentally new things, of what was called at this conference I attended recently, novelty. And they have these little charts of unanswered questions in evolutionary biology, one of which is the origin of the first animals, the Cambrian Explosion. Another is the origin of biological form, of novel traits and structures.
Okay, now so we're talking about leaps, is what you mean, right?
The big changes. The neo-Darwinian mechanism, mutation and selection, does a great job of explaining the small-scale variations that arise.
Is that what we call microevolution?
Microevolution, the changes in the shape and size of finch beaks or the coloration of peppered moths.
Okay, now everybody can understand this, right? That if you're breeding dogs, right, you can see how you go from a small dog to a bigger dog. From this kind of a dog to this kind of a dog. You can get that. But to go from a dog to an antelope or a giraffe, that's something that typically science would say, well, it's random mutations. One day there was some kind of an animal that had this freaky mutation, and it kind of ended up being positive, and so more of those developed. But you're saying that these guys in 2003 saying, no, when you really drill down, that's not sufficient to explain it.
Exactly. One leading evolutionary biologist has said that natural selection, random variation, random mutation does a good job of explaining the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. Small-scale adaptation, yes. Major innovation, no.
And when we say major innovation, what kind of innovation are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about new body plans, which are unique ways of arranging body parts and tissues. We're also talking about new anatomical structures, eyes, wings, the three-chambered or four-chambered heart of a mammal. So major new structures, major new ways of arranging the parts of a body, but also ultimately we're talking about the origin of the information necessary to build those new forms of life.
Okay, that's what you talk about in your book, Darwin's Doubt. You're talking about things that I'd never heard before. In other words, when you say about the design of a cat, like what is involved in that. Most of us, we just look at a cat and go, oh, cat, it's got 4 legs, and it's just like an animal, just like a dog, except a little different. But you're saying that there are all kinds of other things going on that are necessary, and that when you look at those things, you realize it's actually much more complex.
I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they'd say, new code. Same thing turns out to be true of life. You want a new form of life, you have to have the information required to specify, to build the parts and the overall architecture. Where does that come from? It's an unanswered question.
An unanswered question, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. The book is Darwin's Doubt. The website is discovery.org. We'll be right back. Scientist extraordinaire. The book is Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. Now, when you say the explosive origin of animal life, are you talking about the Cambrian Explosion?
I am. It's one of many what paleontologists call abrupt radiations in the history of life on this planet, where you get fundamentally new forms of life emerging abruptly in the fossil record.
Okay, so to make that a little bit more understandable, you're saying that at some point we've all been led to believe that evolution is gradual. It just increments, and over millennia, things change and grow. But there are moments. The Cambrian Explosion is probably the most famous one. It's like 580 million.
530 to 525, something like that.
Okay, 530 million years ago, suddenly something happens. Shazam! All of these life forms seem to come out of nowhere at a speed that doesn't make sense.
Right. Lots of new animal. Most of the first animals on the planet arise during that period of time, and most of the major animal body plans that have ever been existed, that are exemplified by these new animals, arise at that time.
Are we talking about fish at that point?
Actually, it wasn't known until 2009, but now we know that the first fish did arise in the Cambrian as well. So that was another discovery that made it even more explosive from our point of view.
I mean, when you look at a fish are complex. They're very complex. It's not like talking about a leaf. I mean, it's an amazingly complex thing. And you're telling me that 530 million years ago, sort of out of nowhere, you get something like a fish.
Nothing like a fish in the prior pre-Cambrian strata. Nothing like an arthropod, the famed trilobite, which is the iconic form. I was fascinated with them as a little kid. I was fascinated with fish, too. I used to get in trouble on fishing trips when we do the gutting, because I'd play with the swim bladders and the gills. And
You'd play with the swim bladders.
I thought they were interesting.
I don't think anybody has ever confessed that on this show, that they played with the swim bladders. What's the difference between the air bladder? The swim bladder is just what keeps it upright, right?
Well, and it allows the fish to actually modulate its flotation in the water. It's an amazing device, really high tech. So,
isn't it amazing what can arise out of random mutations?
Amazing stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so what do you say in your book, Darwin's Doubt? I'm trying to remember because we've discussed this before. You say that Darwin himself was concerned.
He recognized that this was a problem for his idea that evolution had occurred very gradually over a long period of time. He depicted the history of life as a great branching tree in which very tiny incremental changes would add up to big changes over time.
Right.
What we find in the Cambrian fossil record is the opposite. The big differences between different kinds of animal life are there right from the beginning. It's not like you lead up gradually, but instead of a tree, it's much more like a lawn, or maybe an orchard of separate trees, where you have these major differences that are separated by their differences in form right from the very beginning.
Okay, now this is something that isn't it the case? Correct me if I'm wrong. That Darwin said, in the mid-19th century, that the more fossils we discover, the more we will see, in fact, that there are links between these very disparate things. We're going to find the links between whatever it is, the tiny horse and the modern day horse, or we're going to find those, but in fact, we never found them.
Well, with respect to these Cambrian animals, which was what concerned him, he did anticipate that future fossil finds would fill in those missing ancestral forms that weren't present in the pre-Cambrian strata. In fact, what's happened is we found more new, previously unknown Cambrian animal forms, and they too have lacked ancestors in the Precambrian ancestral record. And so the Cambrian explosion, from our point of view, has become progressively more explosive with each new big Cambrian fossil find.
So the more we dig, literally, the more problems we have found, not less.
The more discontinuous the picture of the history of life is.
Right, which is to say, the bigger the problem has
become.
It's precisely
exactly.
the opposite of what Darwin
Bigger gaps, not smaller ones, with more fossils.
And it's the opposite of what Darwin was hoping
would
happen in the 100 years after he died.
Yeah, so what I did in the book was I told the story of Darwin's initial doubt. It wasn't a doubt about whether his theory was correct. It was a doubt about whether his theory adequately explained all the evidence. And what I do is I trace that doubt and show that what was kind of a mild anomaly in his mind, a curiosity, has grown up to become a major theoretical and fundamental problem for evolutionary theory, which is not only the fossil problem of where are those missing ancestors, but it's also the engineering problem of how do you build all those new forms of life from this basically undirected mechanism that relies on copying errors in DNA to generate new form.
Talk about this idea about building life, because again, most of us, when we look at a cat or something, we just go, yeah, there's an animal. We don't think about what you're talking about, is that where the organs are and all of the details of how, we don't think about that. We just see a cat. You're saying that there is a lot that goes into building these animals and why they're different from each other.
Exactly. And go back to the illustration I used before the break. I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would say, well, code or software or information, and all those are correct instructions,
right.
all correct answers. Right. Turns out the same thing is true of living systems. If you want to build a new form of life, at the very least you've got to have new proteins to service new types of cells, which would in turn be part of new organs and tissues. So where does that information come from to build the protein molecules that are the sine qua non of new living form? And that's the key question. So when we're looking at the Cambrian Explosion with all these new forms of animal life, each of which would require new tissues, organs, and cell types, we know that there must have been new proteins which point to the need for new genetic information. So the Cambrian Explosion isn't just an explosion of new animal form, it's an explosion of new information. And that then becomes the crucial question.
And when do we realize that it was an explosion of information and not just forms? Is that more recent?
Well, it's post-Watson and Crick. It's an implication of the molecular biological revolution wherein Watson and Crick and others discovered that it is digital information in DNA which is running the show inside cells. It is responsible for building the protein molecules that do all the important jobs inside cells.
Okay, so the conference you just came back from, what conference was that, by the way?
This was a conference at the Royal Society in London. It's the oldest and arguably most prestigious scientific body in the world.
Can there be any doubt? Isaac Newton himself was the head of the Royal Society.
He was indeed for 24 years. His portrait.
Before they caught him dipping into the till. Yeah, he was embezzling. Okay, so Isaac Newton was the head of the Royal Society, and of course, anybody who knows science knows the Royal Society is it. And you were just at a conference to do what?
Right, well, the conference was evaluating the neo-Darwinian synthesis and exploring the new theories of evolution that are being proposed by many leading evolutionary biologists who are now very openly saying we need a new theory of evolution to account
and again,
for
that's big news.
The origin of new forms of life, the major innovations, or one of the scientists I referred to earlier, Gerd Müller, gave the opening talk of the theory of the conference, and he talked about the modern Darwinism's explanatory deficits, and he identified several, one of which was the origin of novelty, of new traits, new structures in the history of life. And
so in 2016, top scientists at the Royal Society are themselves declaring this isn't working.
But also think about this. This was the very question that Darwin sought to explain in The Origin of Species in 1859. They're effectively saying we're back to 1858. We don't have an explanation for the origin of new forms of life and the new structures that are required to build them.
What's the general demeanor at a conference like that? It's hard for me to think that scientists would be happy with this development.
Well, many of the scientists were there to propose new alternative mechanisms, and so there was a great spirit of exploration and interest and some spirited discussions. There were some representatives of old-line neo-Darwinism, the textbook theory, and so there were some very tense conversations between some of the few remaining defenders of textbook orthodoxy and the proponents of these new evolutionary mechanisms, which they think are needed to either supplement or replace the old theory.
Okay, so are we talking about things like eyeballs, like when you say, where did the eye come
Where's
from?
Where's an eye come from? Where's a wing come from?
Okay, but so somebody like Gerd, what's the name?
Müller.
Yeah. Does Gerd Müller say that we don't really have an explanation for that, or we're looking for one?
Well, he laid out the problems. Others then proposed other mechanisms that they thought might address them, but it was a very curious aspect of the conference that the new mechanisms that were proposed didn't really address this fundamental problem of novelty.
Okay, we're out of time in this segment. We're going to be right back, folks. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. The book is Darwin's Doubt. Go to discovery.org.
Mele Kalikimaka is the thing to say on a bright Hawaiian Christmas day.
To my big brother George, the richest man in town. That's a Christmas present from a very dear friend of mine.
Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings.
That's right. That's right.
Wow. That's It's a Wonderful Life, in case anybody was wondering. And that little girl who just said, "Hey, Daddy, teacher says every time you go," she's alive. She's in her 70s. And I have a photograph of her holding my Miracles book. No joke. That's so wild. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. Stephen, we were just talking about where we are in the world of science. Again, this doesn't get reported on, the news. That's why I want to talk to you about it. So you're telling me that the top scientists in the world are getting together and saying, we need a new theory. The theory of evolution as it's been presented, random mutation, natural selection, not really cutting it. So you said that at this conference recently in England that they were presenting some possible new ideas. Anything that you thought is any good?
Well, there were a whole series of these new mechanisms proposed, but they seemed to us, and there were a number of proponents of intelligent design there at the conference, seemed to us to be inadequate, interesting, and a lot of them presented some new biology that's been given short shrift by the neo-Darwinian establishment. But the mechanisms didn't seem to solve the fundamental problem that had been laid out at the beginning of the conference, which is how do you build these new structures? Let me give you an example. There's a really astute molecular biologist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro. And he's one of a group of scientists, they sometimes call themselves Third Way. And the first way is neo-Darwinism. The second way is the way that can't be mentioned, which is us, the proponents of intelligent design.
Right.
The third way is finding an evolutionary theory that's still materialistic, but which does not rely on the random mutation natural selection mechanism. Shapiro has presented fascinating evidence that many of the mutations that we know actually occur in cells and in larger organisms are not occurring randomly at all, randomly with respect to the survival needs of the organism, but rather they're under a kind of algorithmic control. He says there's a kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. So if there's an environmental stress that's placed on an organism, it triggers a response in the genetic program to produce certain types of proteins or to mutate certain parts of the genome at an incredibly rapid rate.
That's already coded into it.
But yeah, it's pre-programmed.
Okay, that sounds like we have a problem.
Well, the problem is it's cool biology. It's a mechanism that hasn't been given much attention by the neo-Darwinians.
Yeah.
It's not random, as they say.
Right.
But it presupposes pre-programming, an algorithm.
Yes.
And the origin of that is something that Shapiro doesn't address.
Of course he can't address it.
And that's where intelligent design comes in. Because, again, as we were talking about in the last, in the previous segment that we did, information is the product, in our experience, always the product of an intelligent agent. And so what you've got is these wonderfully complex information processing systems that we call living organisms.
Yeah.
And their ability to respond to environmental stress and adapt is also an amazing feature of organisms, but that is pre-programmed, and the programming is information, and the information requires an explanation.
You know, it's funny, even as a Christian, I find this all frightening. And when I say frightening, I mean when you begin to get glimpses of the intelligence that we call God, of what he has done, it is sort of frightening and awe-inspiring on a level that I mean, to think that, because we always say, oh, God's amazing, he got me parking space or whatever. I mean, when you start drilling down into how amazing, as you're doing, and again, even this is scratching the surface, of course.
It's a cartoon.
But it is just mind-blowing.
It does make you actually a little bit, there is a sense of awe and fear in it, because you realize, we have a colleague, Michael Denton, and he says, in biological systems, it's always the same. It's wheels within wheels within wheels of greater complexity. And it's almost maybe inexhaustible. I mean, we recognize the design patterns, we recognize the information processing strategies, the miniature machines, the nanotechnology, but at a certain level, we realize this is a form of design that we aren't really up to ourselves.
It's stunning. I mean, and who did you say, was it Gerd Muller who said this is like the 8.0 or 9.0?
No. Muller was the
Muller. No, not Muller.
He's a mainstream figure. My friend is a Microsoft computer guy who said, it's. He said, I get an eerie feeling that someone figured this out before us, because he's seeing the same computer design patterns, the same strategies for processing and storing information. But then he lapses into his Microsoft talk and says, except that it's like an 8.0, 9.0, 10.0 version of things that we've done. It's far exceeds.
It really is like a movie.
Yeah.
It's like it's like a movie where they discover something that couldn't possibly be. Something from 10,000 years ago that has the complexity of a modern day computer. You say, I don't know, how could this be? There was another civilization. We have to figure this out. While we're figuring it out, we're going to listen to a little more Christmas music. Folks, I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. If you want to see our Socrates in the City conversation, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com. And I hope that you will send these podcasts to your friends. Go to Metaxastalk.com. If you haven't yet donated to Christian Solidarity International, folks, please go to Christian Solidarity International. It's a banner right at Metaxastalk.com. We send you all kinds of fun prizes, and you get a bigger mansion in heaven. We'll be right back. No idea that he had those kind of pipes, Kanye West. Talking to Stephen Meyer. Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of Darwin's Doubt. You were just saying something I want to repeat about the website.
On the website, darwinsdoubt.com, we have debates and interviews, and including the one I did with you at Socrates in the City, but we've also got a whole playlist of animations that take interested parties inside the cell to see the things we've been talking about. I'd recommend one called Journey Inside the Cell that explains or shows visually what DNA does, how it directs the construction of these protein and protein machines that are needed to keep cells alive. So people have been listening to us talk about DNA and proteins and all these cellular information processing systems. We have animations that actually depict that visually that will help people get a handle on it.
People always wonder, what are you doing at the Discovery Institute? You guys are doing a lot of stuff.
Well, thank you.
I mean, to have these videos is just very helpful.
We got a great team. We got a great animator, a guy in North Carolina named Joseph Candelas, who's just one of the best in the field, and he loves what we do, and he's helped us bring it alive.
Well, I also heard you mention that this book is now available as an audiobook.
Oh, right. Next week, on the 20th of December, both Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell will be released in audio through Amazon for the first time. Audio and Audible.
Yeah. That's huge. That is huge, because these are not necessarily easy books to read, but to hear them, I think that... man, this is just, if you want to do something really ambitious and wonderful, just listening to these books when you jog or drive or something like that. So Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell both
released in audio for the first time next week.
Yeah. Tremendous. That is
exciting for us too, because I have a colleague at Discovery, Jonathan Witt, who's our staff writer, a former English professor, a novelist, and he was helpful to me when I was writing both books, because he kind of consulted with me about narrative structure, and I tried in both cases to tell an overarching story along with the argument that I think helps make the scientific evidence a little easier to grasp.
Well, it's important. I mean, you and I have talked about this. Communication is everything. That, you can have the facts, but then how do you get the facts out there? And you're even saying that about the scientific community, that they're arguing about, we need a new theory, neo-Darwinism isn't working. But that never gets out to the mainstream. I mean, unless people are listening to this radio show, who is going to hear this? They're not reporting on that. They ought to be reporting on that. Those are big headlines.
It's been underreported, absolutely. And there was a little bit of coverage of the Moral Society meeting. Susan Mazur wrote about it at the Huffington Post, or I think at the Atlantic. There was a piece at the Huffington Post. My colleagues Paul Nelson and David Klinghoffer have a nice review article about the conference that's been posted at our Evolution News and Views, and also carried at CNS News. So there is some reporting, but this is a major story in the history of science.
This is huge.
We've had 150 some odd years of Darwinian orthodoxy ruling the field of biology. It's a theory that's had huge implications for not just science, but also for culture and worldview and philosophy. And the theory is utterly on the ropes, and people are groping for new mechanisms to replace the mutation selection mechanism. And they found some new mechanisms, but they haven't solved the fundamental problem of the origin of the information you need to build new forms of life and new structures.
Right. The guy you were talking about who came up with the third way, that begs the question, so to speak, although that's not the right term. But, I mean, you say, okay, that's fascinating, but who came up with that algorithm?
Yeah. Where's the information come from?
You're back to zero.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to answer that question.
Well, and there were other mechanisms proposed that had similar problems, one called niche construction, where, you notice that certain animals like beavers can make dams, and so the beavers change their environment in the ways that might alter their future adaptation to the environment. But the capacity to build a dam is already built into a beaver.
Actually, I got to say, because I saw the article at Evolution News and Views, and there's a picture of the beaver there. The idea of birds, a Baltimore oriole building a hanging nest in a willow tree, how in the world is that possible? When I see a beaver building a dam, it does not seem possible. It does not seem on any level logical that these creatures should be able to do that.
There's clearly a very profound level of pre-programming involved in what we call animal instinct, and that it does, in fact, beg that deeper question of where did those capacities come from? Where did the genetic and other forms of information necessary to build those animal brains with those capacities come from? So if you start to think about life in an engineering perspective, and ask the question, what does it take to construct these complex features, complex structures, complex capacities, then the mutation selection mechanism seems utterly inadequate. Remember, mutations are random copying errors in pre-existing functional code. So often when I'm lecturing, I'll ask the computer scientists in the room, if you have a section of functional code and you want to build a new operating system, can you get there by randomly changing the code you have? If you do, are you more likely to degrade the information or to come up with something fundamentally new?
It's not even close.
It's not even close.
I mean, it's not even beginning to be close.
So this mechanism is really, it ought to be consigned to the pre-1953 era.
But don't you find it funny that, I mean, any fool in the history of humanity who has stumbled upon a dam built by beavers, any fool looks at it and says, there must be a God. There must be something. Like, you're in awe of what you're looking at. It's only in the last decades where secularist, materialist, scientists have beat people over the head and said, don't ask those questions, don't think those thoughts, shut up, that's stupid. I mean, and now you're telling me that those very people have come to the end of
this materialistic approach. Remember, 19th century science is all about matter and energy. 20th and 21st century science is about the discovery of the primacy of information in living systems in particular. Where does that come from? We know of only one source. Again, that's a mind.
A mind. Heavy, man. We're going to be right back with Stephen Meyer. Again, folks, go to metaxastalk.com. Please give to CSI. There are people depending on you. They're depending on your $20. Please, folks, check it out. We'll be right back.
On the fields and the farms and the road to town, and I'm thinking up a letter that I'm writing in my head.
Crosby. Folks, you know the rest of the song. You can sing it after the break. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. Just a few moments left Dr. Meyer, author of Darwin's Doubt, Signature in the Cell, what are the theistic implications? You talk about mind. We know that there must be a mind, there must be an intelligence behind all of this. It doesn't make any rational sense to conclude otherwise. So what are the theistic implications?
Well, that's hotly debated in a way. We're often asked, well, who do you say the designer is? And people have different ideas about that, but I'm a Christian. And I see the implications of the theory of intelligent design in strikingly theistic terms. In fact, I think there's good reasons to think that the designer is God, because we know, first of all, as you were saying, the design that we see in biological systems is evident. It's I think, compelling, but it far exceeds our own capacities. So right away, I think we're dealing with a superhuman intelligence. It's logically possible. Some people have pointed out, Richard Dawkins even suggested in the Ben Stein movie Expelled that maybe the designer was a space alien in outer space. But I think when you take all of the evidence into account that we have in the natural sciences about cosmological as well as biological origins, I think there's a very powerful case to be made for a theistic designer, for the designer being God. Because not only do we have evidence of design in biology, but we also have evidence from the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, which you wrote about in your Wall Street piece, that there has been design built into the very fabric of the universe from the beginning of the universe. And clearly no agent within the cosmos, no space alien, could be responsible for the design built into the laws of physics that apply even to that agent. So there I think you're looking at evidence not only of an intelligence, but of an intelligence that must be transcendent, that must precede the formation of the universe itself. And I think on top of that, there's also the evidence of the new cosmology, the Big Bang theory, that points to a definite beginning of the material universe, the very beginning even of time and space. And so that, I think, also points to transcendence. So I think when you add all that up, the evidence for a definite beginning to the universe, an evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe, and an evidence for the origin of information in living systems, I think you've got a very strong case for an intelligent designer that has the attributes that Jews and Christians have always ascribed to God.
I've always wanted to make a documentary on this very subject. And I think you and I should make a film on this subject.
It'd be awesome. We should team up.
I just wanted to put you on the spot on the radio. I do. I think that there's so much here. We're just scratching the surface.
It's the untold story of science over the last 100 years. And it started in the 20s with the new developments in cosmology. Then the biologists got into the act in the 1950s and 60s, and the information scientists in recent years. And we're still hearing from the new atheists, the Richard Dawkinses and the Lawrence Krauses, about the science that's essentially of late 19th century vintage. This matter and energy are the whole show idea. It's insufficient to account for what we're looking at today.
Insufficient funds. Stephen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
This is a joy.
Fun conversation.
And we are going to do something together that we have to. This information is way too important. Folks, please send these podcasts to your friends. Go to metaxastalk.com where you can find them. And if you don't give to CSI today, I'm going to have to come to your house. You want me to come to your house? Really? Because I'm all upset. I'm angry. Just give anything you can give. Pool your resources with a friend. God bless you.